Good morning, everybody. I'm Ugo Frotesi. I'm here to represent the journal Spatial Economic Analysis. We have this seminar to celebrate its 20th anniversary, and we have six speakers with us. We have Andrea Carrascal-Lincera, we have Roberta Capello, we have Sebastian Krifgans, we have Philip McCann, we have Gianmarco Ottaviano, and in a synchronous way, we will have Sergio Rei. So, in just about 1 hour, we will have the presentation of six very interesting papers. But first, please let me say a few words on spatial economic analysis and on why we got this seminar. Okay, so what is spatial economic analysis? For those who maybe don't remember, so it's a pioneering economics journal dedicated to the development of theory and methods in spatial economics. What is notable of this journal, it is published by two associations that joined forces to create it 20 years ago. These associations are the Regional Studies Association and the British and Irish section of the Regional Science Association International. So it's really a joint venture of two leading learned societies. Spatial Economic Analysis is a journal that tries and publish new methods, new theories, new models, new techniques for the study of spatial economics. You can also see our metrics. This year we are also Q1 in economics in terms of impact factor. And of course, it's a journal whose reputation has been growing in time, and we hope it will continue this growth. So the editors, we have a deputy editor, that is Luisa Corrado, and then we have a group of co-editor who is composed by people from different backgrounds and from different places. So our co-editors are Maria Abreu, Steven Bonsmith, Jan Ditzen, Daniel Felsenstein, Orsa Kekezi, Katarzyna Kopseska, Vasilis Monasiriotis, Gianfranco Piras, Francesco Quattraro, Francisco Ravazzolo, Shuai Alex Shi, Emmanuel Tranos, Dimitri Tsiosas, and Dan Liu. Then Alex Shi is also in charge of our digital media stuff. And finally, we have an early career editor who is actually not that early career, and it's Karolina Romashvili. And then we have an editorial board, and some of the people in the editorial board are also represented here today, and we thank them for that. What kind of paper do we publish? We try and publish three papers. Okay, we publish sound empirical analysis of spatial economic, mostly econometric, but not only. And in the empirical papers, we also want to see a theoretically sound background, so not just empirical replications of what exists elsewhere. Then we are very keen on publishing papers introducing methodologically advances for the study of spatial economics. And third, we also publish theoretical papers, and when we have theoretical papers, we also would like this theoretical paper to have relevance for the real world. The last Best Paper Awards that we awarded for 2025 was to Massimo Giannini, a spatial stochastic frontier model with fixed effects and endogenous environmental variables. For Best Paper published in 2024, Marabika Coley and Anil Bera, to use or not to use the spatial Darby model, that is the question. These are papers for which it's possible to find the two files in online, and so these are methodologies that one can use in their own research. And the best paper for the papers published in 2023 by Milad Abbasi Otterfef, Milian Kruger, Jan Kinne, David Lenz, and Ben Resch, the digital layer alternative data for regional and innovation studies. Now, why we are here today, we are celebrating the 20th anniversary with a celebratory special issue. The first issue of Spatial Economic Analysis was in fact published in 2006. You can see on the right its table of contents. And Bernard Fingleton was the first editor-in-chief and the motor of the first years of this journal. Then in 2015, Paul Ehlers followed and continued the growth of the journal. Now, to celebrate the fact that it's 20 years after the first publication, the first issue of 2026 was an issue with title 20 Years of Spatial Economic Analysis, Evolution, Achievements, and Perspectives on the Field. So in this special issue, we have 10 peer-reviewed articles with an extended editorial. So these articles are all peer-reviewed, and they present themes and techniques in spatial economic analysis that characterize both the present and the future trends. So the idea is that we asked the authors of this paper to provide perspectives for future research, and that will be evident when you will listen to the presentation later on. And some of these papers instead provide new techniques of analysis that can be applied in other situations. So today we have a sample of papers, so the papers that have an arrow, but perhaps it's better if I read the full table of contents. We have Why Size Really Doesn't Matter, from Megacity Myths to Price Sensitivity Prosperity by Andres Rodriguez Pose. We have Exploring the Real Proofs of Interregional Inequality, Spatial Income Distribution in the European Regions by André Carrascal-Incera and Geoffrey Ewings, that will be presented. We have Mind the Gap and the Map, Measuring Distribution and Spatial Income Polarization by Sergio Rey, that will be presented. We have Chasing Opportunity, Spillovers and Drivers of US State Population Growth by Sebastian Krifkans and Vasilis Sarafidis, that will be presented today. We have Technological Change, Knowledge Diffusion and the Growth of Cities and Regions, Analytical, Empirical and Policymaking Challenges by Phil McCann and Raquel Ortega Argeles, that will be presented. We have Old, New, Borrowed and Blue, the 21st Century Spatial Economic Analysis Toolkit by Raquel Franklin, Devika Yain and Zifu Wang. We have Causality in Spatial Economic Analysis with reference to the London Green Belt and House Prices by Bernard Finkelton. We have Mathematical Modeling of Urban Sprawl by Mark Barthelemy and Ulisse Marquis. We have Reshoring in a Spatial Perspective, a Research Agenda by Roberta Capello, that will be also presented today. And finally, we have Digital Network Centrality and the Structure of Good and Trade by Gianmarco Ottaviano, that will also be presented today. Okay, so in 1 hour we will have the presentation of these 6 papers, but before leaving, I want to remember that all articles of the special issue will be freely available online until the end of July. Okay, then after the end of July, some of the papers will be again under a paywall, so it's a good opportunity to download them during this month, otherwise it will be more difficult to access them. Okay, so I finished. I really thank the speakers, and I give the opportunity to speak to André Carrascal-Incera, since we are following the order of the special issue.
Thank you very much, Hugo. Thank you very much, everyone that made this possible. Thank you again for putting together this special issue for this celebration. I want to first start by congratulating everyone that make possible this Spatial Economic Analysis Journal for this achievement. Both Professor Geoffrey Ewings and myself are very happy of contributing with our little piece here, with our little project here, a project that we had in mind for several years, and we finally put together in this paper that I am going to show you a little bit. But for happy as we are, well, I have to start, sorry for ruining the celebrations, but I have to start with some bad news. The paper is about how persistent are spatial inequalities, and we found out that they are very persistent. And basically we find out also that, also with the methodology that we are using here, that reducing these spatial inequalities is almost impossible without changing the economic structure, so the productive specialization of each of the regions. We are also going to provide some new measures of how to measure these spatial inequalities, to see if using this we can design better policies to try to counteract these spatial inequalities. Why we are studying this? Why these spatial inequalities are still happening? Well, from previous studies, we have seen that interregional inequalities in Europe, they were decreasing, they were going down until the 80s, and then from the 80s, they start to go up again. Some previous literature also from Professor Phil McCann, Brancher and Roderick and so many people that study spatial inequalities and why this is a phenomenon tell us that agglomeration effect, structural change the way regions have different absorptive capacity, and so the way regions obtain, generate and retain revenues from the income they generate. But also, the previous literature is quite specific on tell us that the specialization and the interregional trade, moving processes, production processes to high value products, is having an effect on why some regions are benefiting more than others on these trade balances, let's say. So basically, globalization has changed the position that each region has in different value chains, and that is related again with income interdependence, production interdependence, and so on. So basically, the objective of this paper that Professor Higgins and I were doing here is to study how structural this income is generated and distributed along the EU NUTS2 regional level. What we try to do here is to put together a framework that can account for all of these phenomena, all of these effects that I was showing there, all of these causes of these interregional inequalities, absorptive capacity, trade, and income interdependence. Well, that framework is basically a multi-regional input-output model. So we are going to track the structure of this multi-regional input-output model, but not a normal input-output model. Is basically an extended version of input-output model with households that are endogenized inside the system, both from the sources of income and also from the consumption part. So you can check here more or less something that we tell students in their first years, the circular flow of income. And this is basically to represent a little bit how a part or the composition of these extended multi-regional input-output systems have this in the core part. So basically what we are representing with the multi-regional input-output system is this region by region and region connected to other regions, this primary distribution of income. The idea here is that we are going to end up with decomposed part of this is a matrix that is relating households to households, so households in some regions to households in another regions, and we can see how by this full flow of income, we can track the interregional income value chain. So where its household in different regions are located, where is the position of these households in the interregional income value chains, and we can see how much income they receive each time somebody else in another region is spending. So this effect to other regions that I'm showing you there in the diagram, each time a household in a region is spending €1, some of the other regions are going to have some positive effects. The thing here is that these effects are not going to be symmetrical. In fact, what we found is some structural asymmetries that are going to favor in some regions and are going to give some, or that is going to tell us that some of the other regions are disadvantages in these spillover flows that are generated by income when everyone is spending, basically. We create this new measure of income inequality that basically tell us how asymmetric is basically this distribution of income. If you generate more income to the system than you receive from the rest of the regions, it means that you have a negative net effect. If you receive more from the other households spending, this income value change, than what you are generating, you will have a positive net effect here. The bigger these distances between the positive effects and the negative effects, the bigger is going to be this K inequality index that we are providing here. And so it was difficult to do this until now or until very recently because there was no data available at the regional level for such a large amount of regions until we had the EU-Regio database by Mark Thyssen in 2018. It was published. This database is a very nice database with 14 sectors available between the years 2000 and 2010. It was very good because it gave us some homogeneous tables, homogenized for all these years. So we have a decade of tables that we can compare what is happening year by year, and we can see how structural this distribution of income, spatial distribution of income is with this. It's based on the World Input-Output database, and it has almost 450 NUTS regions. So a very nice database, the one we had in here. And basically, this is the main slide that I wanted to show you here. This is the interregional income value change. I'm showing you here the balance. First thing that struck us when we were doing this was how similar these two pictures are. So we did all of these calculations for the year 2000, this circular flow of income that I was telling you before, for the year 2000, for the year 2010, and after calculating everything and doing all of these decompositions, we find out that there are some differences. You can see them if you take a closer look, but they are strikingly similar. This means that as I was saying at the very beginning of the presentation, I mean, interregional inequalities are very persistent. The regions that are, let's say, in the disadvantaged side of this are more or less the same ones. There are not too much changes in there. And the ones that appear in blue, the ones that are benefiting more from how the system is distributing the income that is generated region by region, are more or less the same in the year 2000 and 2010. For those of you that are familiar with the map, with the European map and with the regions, you know more or less, you are already understanding which ones are the ones that are in better positions in this interregional income value change. Those are basically richer regions. So what we do later is we compute this by these means, max, minimum, percentiles by country to check how each country is doing. But also we do some characterization of regions by income categories and population density categories. And we found out something that it was a regularity both for the year 2000 and for the year 2010. Both have very similar numbers. Richer regions benefit more. They say they are in the positive side of this asymmetric balance, and poorer regions, they have always a negative net effect of this interregional income distribution. Then the population density categories, the same thing. Urban regions in this case are the ones that are benefiting more. The more dense, the more they benefit. And then lesser density regions, the ones that are more rural, they benefit less than, or they have a negative net effect. This is again persistent for the year 2000 and 2010. This was quite consistent for both years, and that took us to take this to draw these conclusions here. First, as I was saying just before, richer and urban regions benefit more for how the economic system distributes this income that is generated region by region. So each time a household is spending something, the money flows to some particular regions, richer and urban. They move from rural and peripheral regions to the core of Europe and urban and capital regions. And then we show here by comparing all the years. So we had all the years from 2000 to 2010. We show just 2000 and 2010. We show how persistent these regional gaps are. And also we started thinking here how we can counteract then left behind places, how we can counteract these spatial interregional inequalities. We know from this framework that direct transfer cannot be the policy to go through, because each time you give money to poorer regions and peripheral regions or rural regions, when they spend it, they create even larger gaps there. Finally, we are just saying that, or we are seeing here that, and just taking into account primary distribution of income, that centripetal forces, agglomeration, absorptive capacity, these things that we were talking at the beginning, seems to be winning the game to regional industrial policies and cohesion policies. And that's basically it. Thank you very much again for the opportunity, and congratulations again for the celebration.
Thank you very much, Andre, for being perfectly on time. I mean, this thing of inequality is very important in your paper, but also within the special issue. And it's also linked to the next presentation by Sebastian Krifkans, which is an opportunity. Will you share your screen?
Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to present this paper, which is about opportunities. It's a great pleasure to present here, and It's very nice to have this paper published in this special issue with lots of other interesting papers. So it's an empirical paper about spillovers and drivers of US state population growth, where we examine the drivers of US state population growth with some interesting econometric methods that sit at the intersection of dynamic panel data models, spatial econometrics, and factor models. So essentially, we are estimating this econometric model here, where the dependent variable is US state population growth. It's a dynamic model that features a lag-dependent variable, yt minus 1, which captures state dependence. So essentially, persistence over time, which is an inherent characteristic of quite a lot of variables that we are interested in general to analyze. Then we have the second term on the right-hand side. That's what's called a spatial lag, which captures spatial interactions, spillover effects. It's basically endogenous feedback from other units, how population growth in one region, in one state, spills over to another state. Then we have some regressors, exogenous variables of interest, XIT, and what's quite important and maybe novel compared to many other studies is in the combined error term, we are allowing for unobserved common factors, common shocks that can affect all of the states at the same time. And also what's possibly novel compared to the existing literature, but also very important is if you see all of these coefficients have a little subscript I, so we are allowing for heterogeneous slopes. The feedback elasticities, the elasticities to any of these shocks or regressors can be different for each state I, which I think is a very important feature of the model. Now, given that this model is quite rich in dynamics and dependencies, you really need to be very careful in how to estimate all of these effects of interest. And the method we are using is also relatively recently developed. Essentially, we are using a novel two-stage spatial instrumental variables estimator that was developed by my co-author Vasilis Sarafitis together with some other co-authors in recent work. And specifically to accommodate these heterogeneous slopes, we use a mean group estimator. That's quite common in the literature where you have a large time dimension and try to estimate such panel data models with heterogeneous slopes. Importantly for everyone watching who might want to estimate such models themselves, everything that we present here in terms of estimating this model is readily available for applied researchers with our own Stata package that you can download from the web and easily install in Stata. In fact, this data package is even more flexible than what I present here, and I'll say a bit more at the end what else it can do. Another contribution is, and this is, I think, gaining quite a lot of attraction in recent years, that we are not just taking the spatial weights, these WIJs, as given, say, as binary contiguity measures, which states are bordering other states, or inverse distance measures, which have been commonly used for many, many years. Instead, we are actually going down to the data and estimate these weights from the data, which also has a big advantage that we can allow for asymmetric weights. If you think about geographic weights, well, the distance from one state to the other is the same as the other way around, so you cannot really have asymmetric spillovers. While with this approach here, that's also still under development by Vasilis and some of his co-authors. we can actually allow for not just asymmetric weights, but actually we let the data speak and tell us what are these dependencies across states. For this project, we haven't collected our data ourselves, but we have taken it from a recent Econometrica paper by Kleinman, Liu, and Wedding. Talking about estimating the spatial weights, that's how the estimated network looks like. Something that might be visible is that quite often actually adjacent states are not significantly connected to each other. So if you're just taking a binary contiguity matrix, this would be a very different spatial network that you would be assuming. To the contrary, there are quite some long distance connections between the states. The most connected states are those along the east coast and in particular in the northwest of the US, while most of the states that lie in the middle and the center of the US are relatively weakly connected only with other states. That's at least what the data tells us. I'm not going to show you big tables with coefficient estimates, just want to summarize the results here. We do find that population growth displays heterogeneous conditional convergence. In particular, the convergence is very heterogeneous, emphasizing that it's important to allow for these heterogeneous slopes in the estimation. Most states do converge, but there's also a small group of high growth countries that still diverges, and in this way increases actually between states inequality. The core drivers of population growth, and that's not very surprising, are local amenities, labor income, and with a negative sign, migration frictions. These results are all qualitatively robust across different network specifications. So we did actually also estimate these models, say with a spatial weights matrix based on inverse distance or just simply adjacency matrix. Qualitatively, these results are very robust. The one thing that we only find a statistical significant effect for with our data implied network structure was effects on population growth from productivity. Again, we would actually expect such productivity effects, but interestingly here, if we hadn't estimated the weights from the data, we would actually not detect the presence of such effects. So again, estimating the weights metrics themselves can uncover some otherwise hidden mechanisms as well. All of these spillovers that we find are economically meaningful, and they do account roughly for 1/3 of the total effects. And given the nature of the network structure, they are not just restricted to contiguous neighbors. Just very briefly, I think it's very important to have a closer look at the heterogeneity of the effects. A lot of the literature in the past has just focused on average direct or average indirect effects, while you can actually get a lot out of your results if you really look at, say, what are the effects of just looking at a shock or an innovation in a particular state or group of states on other states. So what we've done here exemplarily, we've just looked at what happens to a shock that affects only the states in the Midwest region on other states. And we see, well, not surprisingly, other states in the Midwest region are affected most. So there are still the strongest spillover effects for closely proximate for states that are in close proximity. But there are also spillover effects to other states, again in the Northwest or along the East Coast. But you can see easily there's a lot of heterogeneity about these spillover effects. So to wrap up, it's very straightforward to also apply these estimation methods to more complex models. So you could allow for higher order autoregressive dynamics. Doesn't just need to be an AR1 model. You could allow for more flexible spatial time lag structures, such as also a delayed contagion. You could allow for what's called a spatial Durbin model, spatial spillovers directly arising from the regressors. And you can even allow for endogenous regressors that go beyond the correlation with these unobserved factors by using external instruments. I should just, I think I forgot this earlier, mention about the method. The way we are identifying the effects here is we are using internal instrumental variables by removing the effect of these unobserved common factors, and then we use these internal instruments to estimate the model. All of these extensions are implemented in our Stata package, and there's virtually no restriction to the empirical applications. As long as you have some dynamics, some spillover effects, you can think of a lot of applications for which these methods are suitable, as long as you have sufficiently large data sets. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. I like this paper because it provides a twin contribution. So it has consequences, but also present methodologies that future authors can apply elsewhere. So now we proceed with Philip McCann that will present the paper on technological change in knowledge diffusion and the growth of cities and regions.
Well, also as the previous speakers have said, thanks very much for allowing us to be part of this. It's a terrific special issue, a great set of papers. In this particular paper, what we're doing is looking at how economists and economic geographers think about the notion of knowledge diffusion, knowledge spillovers, knowledge transmission, how the way we think about those processes have changed over recent decades on the basis of different analytical frameworks and also different empirics. So if we go back over about a 60-year period, something of that kind of time length, kind of informs how we think about these things today. If you look at the second half of the 20th century, when we think about economic growth, whether it's macro growth or we're thinking about regional or city growth, the influence of the Solow-Swan model was really dominant for 4 or 5 decades. So overwhelming number of models on regional growth or city growth during the second half of the 20th century are variations on themes which are motivated by the kind of Solow-Swan type of framework, where you've basically got an economy made up of constant returns to scale. You have kind of production function convergence models, and then anything which you can't explain in terms of the factor allocations, factor stocks, or changes in those, then we refer to in kind of TFP, total factor productivity. That's kind of obviously the additional growth drivers. Now, the way that we think about those is total factor productivity obviously came out of in a sense, trying to square the circle with an accounting identity. Herbert Simon was the first person to explain that. So the way we tend to think about TFP type framings is really in terms of knowledge and technology. So the kind of analytical models, I mean, the foundation models are really goes back to 1964 as the Bordson-Stein book, Economic Growth in a Free Market. And then there's variations on that. So the Blanchard and Katz work in 1992 in Brookings, Barrow, Sally Martin's publications in 1992, 1995, the journal paper and the book Convergence. And then that spawned a whole literature around the 1990s and the early 2000s around the notion of convergence clubs, that maybe it's not all regions are converging, but they're converging in different ways, different speeds. So you've got clubs of regions converging in different ways. If we step back a little bit and we go back to the kind of modern foundations of urban economics, so we look at Alonso, Mills, Fujita, they only talk about knowledge in the sense of being localized spillovers. So that within those framings, the notion of knowledge and spillovers was very much an intra-urban phenomenon, not an inter-regional phenomenon. It's not really something that was discussed. The reason is because largely the assumption about the growth of knowledge across the regional system is basically inherent in the convergence of production functions through factor mobility. So as people move and capital moves, then you get the convergence of regional production functions, the limit of which is that all regional production functions converge to being the same homothetic or homogeneous functions. That's the Boltzmann-Stein proof, on which Blanchard, Katz, Barrow, Sally Martin, and so on all built. We start to get a change in thinking around the late 1980s with the work of people like Romer, Lucas, Sagan, and Howard. Now, this kind of work obviously was not regional, it was at a national level, but some of the thinking behind them was regional, particularly Romer's work was thinking around that. And then the work of, the important breakthrough pieces of work by Paul Krugman with his JPE article and also his little MIT book, the Glaser et al. JPE paper, Michael Porter's work on competitiveness, picked up on a lot of themes. They were already there kind of in the ether and picked up on these themes that cities play a key role in those internal kind of increasing returns to scale through the endogeneity of knowledge spillovers driving productivity. That was very much a kind of shift in thinking. And it was quite an important first step away from the kind of 40, 50-year tradition following Solow and Swan. And obviously the difficulty here is if we're thinking about the role that knowledge and technology plays in growth, particularly at the city level, these spillover arguments, there's a problem of how do we know? How do we see this? Well, the first generation studies, you get a lot of the literature that talk about MAR externalities and Jacobs, MAR, Marshall, Arrow, Romer. I have to be honest, I've always remained fairly uncomfortable with these two descriptions, and I'll explain why. Arrow wasn't, in his original work, particularly in his review of economic statistics work and RE study, he wasn't thinking about agglomeration in any sense, he's thinking about internal production within companies. Romer is a slightly different because it's much more about an externality spillover argument, but again, not in the cities. The link is Marshall. Of course, people talk about Marshall all the time. But actually, if you look at what Marshall wrote in his book, his reference of kind of industrial districts agglomeration is basically 2 pages out of 200. So it wasn't a kind of a serious analysis in any sense. It was just a kind of an anecdotal set of observations. And more importantly, they weren't made by him. They were almost word for word copied from the 1951 British parliamentary inquiry into the extension of the railway system into Manchester, almost word for word, which was the parliamentary document's a brilliant document. It's much more detailed than Marshall's arguments. So he basically just obviously incorporated observations from other people in his work. And so we tend to ascribe a kind of a Gnostic significance to Marshall, which I don't think is there. And that's also the case for Jacobs. This is just a personal view. I mean, I've read all of Jacobs' books, and I've got them on my shelves. But she was a phenomenologist. She wasn't talking about economics particularly. I mean, I find her books quite frustrating to read. Actually, they're all over the place. They're very journalistic in nature, which is what she was doing. That doesn't mean that people hadn't thought about these. There is a brilliant research program, which was the New York Metropolitan Region research program set up between 1957 and 1960 under the auspices of Raymond Vernon and driven by the Regional Plan Association of New York. And out of it came 3 extremely important books: the Lichtenberg book, 1/10 of a Nation, the Hoover and Vernon book, Anatomy of a Metropolis, and then the Vernon book, Metropolis, 1985. To me, they are still classics. What they did was they went extremely carefully, sector by sector, location by location within New York, industry by industry, and they looked at how industries develop, and they encapsulated this in what today we would think of as a product cycle model. In fact, Vernon's 1966 famous QJE paper on international trade, investment, and the product cycle, which gave rise to the whole international business literature, came out of the observations of New York. He wasn't looking at international things. He was looking at what happened inside New York, the mobility of different types of activities within the city and spreading out as knowledge advances replaced by new ones. I mean, my view is you don't need Marr or Jacobs. Really, the US work, the earlier US work in the 1950s and 1960s is really, for me, the benchmark. It's fantastic work, but it's been largely overlooked in economic geography, and I don't really understand why. Then there's a second generation studies where people do try to get a handle on how do we capture and observe knowledge flows. So you have the famous work by people like Adam Jaffe and his colleagues on patent trails, looking at the citation locations. Zoltan Ach, David Aldridge leading the work in terms of university research spillover. There's also innovation within companies, and then the work of people like Luke Anselim with the Televaga and co. Looking at innovations also between the university sector and other businesses and between businesses and each other. I thought Ed Glaser's work with Dave Murray on human capital was very important. Cities and skills, again, that, other notions, that's much closer to the Lucas work. We also get embodied human capital and migration, some of the work I was involved in with Alessandro Fajan. And then case studies, some important ones, Annalise Saxenian, for example, building on a kind of a Porter type logic, looking at how different industry groupings and places operate. And it's all about knowledge flows. And then you've got the kind of global city type story, the kind of buzz, Tony Venables, Michael Storr. But the idea that there's so much going on, it kind of acts as a magnet, drawing people and investment into those places. But still, after all these years of evidence, we go back to the original question, well, what's the knowledge and growth advantages of specialization versus diversity? The answer is it's basically the jury is still out. Seems to be about 50-50. And there's been a range of meta-analyses on this. The Mello et al. Work, De Groot et al. There's a couple there, Baudry, Skiffer over in research policy. It seems to be pretty much even. It depends on what we're talking about, where we are and what kind of industries and so on. And so this has given rise to other areas to try to tackle these problems. And an important one is the kind of knowledge relatedness, knowledge connectedness literature. And there's two broad schools of thought within that. There's the related variety work, people like Kuhn Frank and Ron Boschmer, Frank Van Oort, and so on. Many, many people worked on that. And then there's the relatedness and complexity literature going back to Ricardo Hausmann, Cesar Hidalgo, and then lots and lots of people have worked on that. And they look at relatedness principles applied to technologies, to skills, to institutions, to trade patterns, trying to understand the kind of co-occurrence and the closeness of growth processes. And the kind of message, the take-home message from this field is very much that growth tends to work primarily around your existing competencies and skill sets. And that links to the broader science policy work around things like capabilities, competences, and so on. But even so, with all this evidence, there's still a lot of ambiguity about knowledge diffusion. The links to, in particular, how knowledge diffusion, trade, and growth across space. Is it really about spreading effects? Is that what we're talking about? Is that the kind of diffusion? Is that what's dominant? Or is it really about more knowledge you have actually generates more localization? Again, the jury's still out on these things. There seem to be different observation in different contexts and in different places. And a big problem here is that the fundamental underlying underpinnings of many of our economies have changed dramatically. So if you go back to the 1960s, the Boltzmann-Stein world, right up to Barrow-Saling-Martin and the like, that was a world of convergence. In fact, Barrow-Saling-Martin's economic growth book of 1995 is 370 pages, 400 pages, and the word divergence doesn't appear once, not in the whole book, because it was inconceivable for people at the time that you could have divergence in growth, because growth and convergence were symbiotic. That's basically go back to the production function models of Boltzmann-Stein and the like. They were the same thing. The shocks of the early 20th century, particularly driven by the global financial crisis. I know there's a lot of talk around the China shock, but in many countries, that's a very marginal effect. The big shock was the global financial crisis. And that was basically led to the shift away from convergence in almost all industrialized societies to dramatic divergence in many cases. Some countries were earlier into that process. The UK was the first one to go from convergence to divergence. That regime change started in about 1985, 1986, but many countries, including the US, it was basically with the onset of the global financial crisis is when you start to see the divergence. And today, divergence is the name of the game in most countries. Convergence is now the exception. If you think about convergence driven by agglomeration advantages, which would be the kind of Bautzen-Stein story of the 1980s and 1990s, only about 4% of the OECD population today live in agglomeration-driven interregional convergence processes. It is by far the least characteristic. So these papers around convergence clubs, I don't know, I haven't seen a paper on convergence clubs for many, many years because there are so few of them. What we see are divergence processes. And that is something which is different in different countries. In some cases, divergence is driven by big cities, a metro story. That's the US, that would be Canada, France as well. In other countries, divergence processes are driven by lots of different types of sizes of places. That would be the UK, that would be Germany, that would be Italy. There are a small number of places where growth is driven by core regions, very much versus peripheral, that would be France. But in other cases, it's that growth is kind of quite distributed. Both growth and divergence are highly distributed. That's the US again. So actually, you've got 4 different types of growth multiplied by 2 because some of them lead to convergence and some lead to divergence. So today's OECD realities is we have 8 different growth trajectories across the OECD, and they're quite evenly distributed by country and population. So the kind of general understanding of convergence and knowledge is the world is different today. And one of the big arguments is that it's because of the rise of intangibles, the kind of new generation of knowledge investments, which have particular features. There were people like Jonathan Haskell. Knowledge is scalable, intangible knowledge investments, which are increasing at a tremendous rate. They're scalable, they're sunk, they generate synergies and spillovers. Scalable and sunk point to spatial concentration, high levels of agglomeration, the Silicon Valley type of story. Whereas synergies and spillovers, they could be either localized or diffuse. You could have urbanization or localization. They could be interregional or intra-regional. Again, the jury's out on these things. We just don't know. So there's different methodologies for measuring this. In recent years, have become a lot of new core methodologies for analyzing knowledge diffusion. So, for example, citation and network analysis, network-based models. There's collaboration network data now, a huge amount of papers in journals looking at collaboration between actors, whether it's universities, whether it's companies and so on research and innovation related activities and looking at the geography of that. You've got the kind of main path analysis of knowledge frontiers, looking at the different aspects of knowledge, leading knowledge versus lagging knowledge, where those things are located. You've got R&D network models, different types of collaborative processes, again, of different forms. And then you've got all the cognitive proximity-based frameworks. That's the relatedness type of literature. And then you've got a lot of information diffusion models because we just have so much data now that previously wasn't there, including web scraping data on new types of innovations, new types of employments, technologies, and so on. So I'll just finish, I'll just flip through slides. You said there's lots of new data for analyzing regional knowledge diffusion processes. And in our paper, we outline all the different types of data approaches, data sources, data techniques, and databases that people are using now for all these different types of research across bibliometric and citation data, talent mobility, collaboration processes, social media, of course, is a big one now. Classic patent data still in there. Innovation surveys, going back to the OECD-led processes. But then also new AI-based data on kind of labor and skills demand, like CAS type of thing. And then also there's a new generation of qualitative case studies looking at institutional and governance issues, all of which play a role. So I think I'll stop there, Ugo.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's really a very wide literature, and also it was helpful to have this outline and understanding where it's going and what are the going to the new directions also in this one. Now we have 2 papers that are both related to globalization. I start with Roberta Capello, Reshoring in a Regional Perspective, a Research Agenda.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. Here we are. So it was a pleasure also to be invited to this important special issue. I decided to present something I was working on since a few years, and especially this idea of reshoring, which is coming up since some years, where the idea is that firms choose to bring production back, and because of different reasons, the geopolitical risk, the issue of the fact that offshoring is not so, let's say, strong from the point of view of the quality of the image and of the production and so on and so forth. So there is a lot in the literature. So reshoring has been analyzed at the firm level. I wanted to bring it at the regional level with a regional perspective, and the paper is really a research agenda for mostly for the future. In particular, what I tried to do, what I tried to do was to assess in the paper whether what we know in terms of existing theories that explain the local impacts of offshoring, which was the opposite phenomenon that we had, these existing theories are capable, when adjusted, of course, of explaining the phenomenon of reshoring and the impact of reshoring at the regional level. So the paper goes through three intertwined areas of JVC studies, and that are, let's say, extremely well known, which are the local value creation and the rent capture through JVCs by local economies, JVCs and regional development, because if you capture rent, then you grow, and JVCs and regional income inequalities, which is related to how regional development and the impact of JVC or regional development spreads across regions, poor and rich, and across different groups of regions, but not only of groups of people living in the regions, of groups of production factors located in different areas. So there is a lot to say in that. And for each of them, the paper aims to offer especially a research agenda, because as we will see, there is not so much in the literature yet, also because the phenomenon is new. So concerning the first area, local value creation and rent capture through JVCs. So what the theory of offshoring says is that there is this famous smile curve approach, which is developed at the firm level, where it says that it depends whether you get and capture the value of global value chains depends on the functions that you keep and those that you spread out. So the idea, and in this case, this idea that the production factor, the production area was the one getting less value added with respect to the design area, so the pre and post production phases of the production of the value chain was highly developed at the firm level and also at the regional level. And we had a lot of analysis highlighting how and which regions were the headquarter regions with respect to the factory regions in Europe, and what happened with this sort of issue. But then what we have is that, here we are, what is going to change from the conceptual point of view if one wants to interpret the capacity of a region to increase the value obtained by its participation in JVCs when reshoring takes place. So where does the production go? Which kind of functions do we bring back? Which is the capacity of a local economy to get and to capture the value that comes back? And this is a really complex question, Why? Because the value obtained depends on the capacity of the region to go through a functional upgrading. And the upgrading of functions in the region, in its turn, depends on the local capacity to attract higher level activities or to increase local ones as a substitute for previously exported goods. So the paper suggests that the conditions under which evolutionary processes of related diversification, which is like the ones that are the way in which these are called in the literature, like replication and exaptation, take place seem not to be yet explored in depth in the literature. So in the paper, there are some future avenues of research that are highlighted more in depth in this part of the area of study. Then the paper moves to JVCs and regional development. And here we have a very rich theoretical apparatus for the interpretation of offshoring and regional development. We have the idea of the interconnection between local and global networks, which started with the idea of informal cooperative attitudes stemming from trust and sense of belonging, and the link of these types of local networks with trans-territorial networks, so inter-regional networks, that allows the local area to merge collective learning processes with new knowledge acquired from outside. So, and this idea is that when you are interconnected with at the world level, you avoid lock-in mechanisms and specific technological organization and managerial knowledge. So we have, this was the starting point, but then we had a huge literature on that. We have another bunch of literature dealing with the geography of functions, so which explains, so where you have a location of particular combination of functions, they can explain the presence of transnational networks in specific regions. So, and the idea that there are functions that are more spatially sticky and have an inertia are the in moving in space are the high-level functions, especially R&D and headquarters activity that explain their presence and their persistence over time in cities and more advanced areas. And again, here, offshoring takes place in the production functions much more than the R&D and headquarters activities. Another group is literature is the role of specific assets like institutional quality that can explain why certain regions have a higher, why there is in a certain regions why in certain regions JVCs lead to higher regional development. So the theoretical apparatus here for the interpretation of offshoring and regional development is very rich. But, and this is something that we have to be aware of, it is not applicable to understanding the processes of acquiring advantage at regional level when one speaks of reshoring processes in a region. So the paper again here shows why, if you reverse the trend of investments and you bring back production, what we were thinking about in terms of local advantages when you offshore cannot be reversed to so simply reverse to explain the reshoring processes. So the paper suggests that the effects of reshoring depend on the type of reshoring. Again, there are a lot of types of reshoring that can take place. You can have backshoring, so you bring back production where it was previously produced. You can have a nearshoring, so you bring production close to where it was produced. But all these creates different types of effects and different types of regions in the reshoring processes. So those, for example, that we can call the home reshoring regions, that are those that decide whether the firms are located and decide to bring back a reshoring process, or regions that host the reshoring process, so that receive the production that was sent out. And the characteristic of these regions are extremely different, and the effects of these are very different. Then the paper moves to the JVCs and regional income inequalities. So offshoring strategies, there is a clear statement that offshoring strategy influence labor supply and demand at the local level, where production is, let's say, brought out of the area. And they create lower opportunities for low-skilled jobs and higher opportunities for high-skilled ones. This inevitably results in higher inequalities among wage earners, increasing interpersonal inequalities, intra-regional inequalities, and even inter-regional inequalities for different reasons, because these groups of people are present in different combinations in the different regions, in the rich and the poor, so the effects are extremely heterogeneous across space. So if shoring, the point is, if offshoring, so if the literature agrees that offshoring has been interpreted as depressing wages and increasing profits, this is another very important point. There are also interfunctional inequalities that that increase. And so, as I say here, offshoring depresses wages and increases profits. Do we have to expect reshoring to affect income distribution in the opposite direction? And so can we restore an equilibrium in the inequalities that we created with offshoring? So the paper suggests that this is not the case. Although studies on the effect of reshoring on regional labor markets are very limited, also because the phenomenon is quite, let's say, recent. The paper claims that within the geographical concentration of capital and high-level jobs, as well as automation possibilities that are different in the different regions, the impact of reshoring in all its forms on regional inequalities is rather complex and definitely deserves more research. So conclusions, what can we take away from the paper? The existing theoretical apparatus that explain offshoring in a regional perspective is not easily applicable to reshoring. So we need some new thinking, which is still not there. Reshoring is a complex process. The various ways in which reshoring can take place have to be analyzed separately, and they probably call for separate conceptual approaches. Reshoring calls for a careful analysis of its impact on the local economy more than in the case of offshoring, as it inevitably affects local relationships, the local mix of functions, the types of workers, and the flows of knowledge within and outside the area. So it's a real lesson. If it goes on with the idea of the economic security strategy that the EU is trying to put in place, the effects will be, at the regional level, will be extremely strong. The paper demonstrates that space maintains an intrinsic, specific, and direct role in influencing the local effects of reshoring. So given the same structural conditions in two regions, regional reshoring, the process of reshoring can provide different effects according to the characteristics that are, let's say, that are embedded in the society and in the local community. And this is something that, again, needs further thinking and extreme attention by regional economists and regional scientists. So much needs to be done in this respect, and the paper provides a future research agenda. And I think that's it. This is the paper, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Roberta. Really interesting because you showed how things in globalization are not working linearly in two directions, and so you really open an agenda for researchers that want to follow. We now have the paper by Gianmarco Ottaviano on which is somehow related because also it's relevant to global flows, and the title is Digital Network Centrality and the Structure of Goods Trade. So you can share your own presentation.
Okay, so thank you first of all for having involved me in this special issue. I think this is really an important moment for the field and for the journal. And what I'm presenting is something that is, in a sense, trying to merge some notions that have been widely used in spatial economics along the years, and in spatial and regional science even before, with some basic and, if you want, type of analysis that is used routinely in international trade. So here the idea is that we well know that distance affects international trade. This fact is embedded in models and also in empirical analysis that are based on the concept of gravity. So distance is reducing the interaction between countries. This works at several levels. One of the levels is international trade in goods and services. Of course, that it matters for services is rather obvious because a lot of services, especially digital services, are really traded through distance, but only through digital infrastructure. Now, what is more interesting is that digital infrastructure also affects trading goods. And this is a paper about showing how this effect is important and should be part of the toolbox of international trade analysis to understand, especially how trade may evolve in the future. So the punchline here is going to be that digital infrastructure is an important aspect of international interactions and exchanging goods, and the network structure of this digital infrastructure is fundamental. So what economists, trade economists know very well, and policymakers too, is that, well, geography matters because it affects trade through distance, through border effects, through language affinities or differences, former colonial ties or other type of institutional agreements like trade agreements. And recently, also, what has become very prominent, at least in this field, is geoeconomic or geopolitical alignment. But modern trade also depends on digital infrastructure. And so the question that this paper is addressing is how does a country's position in the global digital infrastructure network shape the geography of goods trade? So digital infrastructure is not just a trade cost, it is a network aspect. And this is where the long tradition of spatial economic analysis, I would say regional studies in general, comes in. A lot of studies in economics, but also across different fields in economic geography, is looking at proxies that I label here standard of digital topology, so the characteristics of access to the digital infrastructure. So internet penetration, broadband access, ICT indices, digital readiness, these are things that have been studied a lot. Something that has been studied, and again, one just reads back in some of the previous issues of spatial economic analysis, but has not been developed fully in terms of trading goods, is the idea that most of the connections, the digital connection goes through subsea cable networks. And therefore, the country network position may be very important, especially in terms of digital embeddedness and market access. So the digital adoption at country level tell us how digital a country is, but for trade and trade in goods and services, it is network topologies that really is important because it tells us where the country sits in the global digital system. So the idea here is essentially, I mean, that the arrows may go sometimes also in the opposite directions, But the main idea here is that there is a dimension of physical geography that interacts with digital network topology, and this affects information availability, and this is going in the end to affect how trade materialize and the bilateral trade flows between countries. This type of frictions that are linked to information availability have been, of course, studied along the years a lot. And we had before the presentation by Philip McCann that was looking at the diffusion of knowledge. So this idea that distance affects information availability is ingrained in the way we think from the point of view of economic geographer and spatial economist. And in international trade, so from the point of view of, if you want, spatial economists, there is a model which is central, and it is gravity model. It comes from, the name comes from analogy with physics, and so the idea that two planets attract each other a lot if they're big and if they're close. And this is essentially the idea that was introduced in the last century about this an analogy in international trade. A lot of trade between countries that are big and are close in both the physical sense, but also in the institutional sense. And this equation here that I'm not going to comment much on is essentially there because I want to make the point that while initially this gravity approach was a sort of a metaphor-based type of tool that actually happened to work pretty well in the data, these days it has been microfunded on models of spatial interactions. And this is important because these models can be quantified, so they can become structural models that are estimated and simulated. And one of the main ingredients of these models is indeed some kind of gravity relation that for people like me that are interested also in the regional dimension, it has to do both with trading goods and services, but also it has to do with the mobility of people. A lot of evidence the mobility of people is also affected by distance. So here is essentially the idea. Distance affects information frictions, but also the network position if the digital infrastructure is transmitting information is going to affect the information frictions. And so digital network embeddedness enters the gravity model by reducing distance amplified information frictions. And so the physical distance matters less for countries that are more deeply embedded in the global digital network. So this is the hypothesis that is discussed and tested in the paper, but it's also some way derived from this underlying theoretical setup. Data that are used, so the approach here has been to be meant to be very standard in terms of gravity estimation. The econometrics is what is used nowadays as structural gravity. The data are the data that are used by trade economists, so this French source, the CP from the CP. And what I'm studying is a period between 2015 2020, but this is not because we don't have data for that, for trading those in those years, but because the accessibility of the data from the main data source, which is telegeography, before 2022 was much easier than now. So it's not important, I think, that we are not covering in this analysis, we're not discussing about the very recent years because the point is more general. So the point is that I want to make is that network position in the digital infrastructure network is going to affect trade flows. So countries are nodes in this digital network. Direct cable links are edges. And then there is a parallel network of goods trade. So countries are also nodes in the trade networks. And well, if you want shipping links are replace cable links in that type of network. So what I want to give to convey is the idea there are these two superposed networks that interact with one another, and trade economists that paid more limited attention to the digital network and the effects it has on trade. So what central means? So in this type of digital network, and why a country that is central in some sort of definition may have an advantage in terms of information access. So here, this is where network analysis comes in, and again, long tradition in the journal, in our journal. There are different, of course, definitions of centrality here, and in the paper I've analyzed 4 of them that are some way the most relevant for my analysis, but also some of the most used in other papers. So there is a concept of being connected to well-connected countries, which is called eigenvector centrality. There is a notion of many direct cable connection to your place, weighted degree centrality. Maybe your place is located on important routing path. This is the betweenness and centrality, or is just the simplest definitions, closeness, a short network distance to others. Now, but when you go and read a bit more about data science and information science, it's the idea that you get from that literature is, and also if you think about the concept that we just laid out, the preferred proxy of digital embeddedness is eigenvector centrality. So a country's centrality is connected to other central countries. So quality of connection matters, not only quantity. Now, when you use this and you introduce this type of concepts of centrality into a gravity equation, the theoretical expectation is that you should find if being central allows you to get better informational access, then we should allow a country to some way attenuate the negative effect of distance on goods trade. So here I want to stress again, it is not trading digital services, in which case it is fairly obvious that digital connectivity is crucial. It is trading goods, so things that are not transported by the digital network. And this is the hypothesis, and it's also what the paper is showing, is that indeed, if you look at the graph on the left-hand side of these slides, you may have countries that have low digital embeddedness, think low centrality, and countries that have high digital embeddedness, high centrality. So the former are red, the latter are blue, and the idea is that trade as distance increases, as distance increases, is going to fall in both cases, but this penalty of distance is less penalizing in the case of countries that are highly embedded in the digital network. So digital, and the main message is that digital network embeddedness flattens the distant trade gradient. Now you can look at, this is the first result. The second result is that you can look at whether this is helping exporting countries or importing countries. So whether you are central in the digital network is helping you to reduce the penalty of distance when you are an importer, or rather when you are an exporter. Of course, it's going to help in both cases, but this empirical analysis reveals that for the exporter effect, so the digital embeddedness of the exporters is helping the exporter more than the parallel situation for an importer. And this can be rationalized in terms of better search, better matching, better coordination. So digital embeddedness, result 2, is especially valuable for exporters. And this can be rationalized through the increased ability to identify, reach, and serve geographically distant markets. Result 3 is, different centralities, different economics. So the paper, and we don't have time to go through this here, but the paper is trying to tease out the effects of different types of centrality measures that we discussed before, together with interpretation that we have discussed before, to see which one is more central, in a sense. Allow me this type of loop in my wording. But so the result is that it's not any centrality that matters, or all centrality measures matter in the same way. Indeed, as I was anticipating, the third result is that different forms of digital centrality capture different economic channels, as are listed there, And therefore, you can also interpret the different relevance of the estimates in the empirical analysis in terms of these economic forces. Now, one may say, okay, you show that there is this attenuation of the distance effect due to embeddedness in the digital network. But is that relevant in any sense, or at least in economic sense? So you can clearly take the estimated coefficients, and then you can do some back-on-the-envelope calculations. Here is one of them. Take a route from Europe to East Asia, physical distance about 10,000 kilometers, compare to places in Europe that are differently embedded in the digital network. One has higher digital embeddedness by 1 standard deviation. The effect is that it's quite huge in terms of reducing the effective distance. So this is not a literal reduction in physical distance, of course, should be handled with care, but it is just an intuitive way of illustrating that the economic magnitude of digital connectivity, of the effects of digital connectivity on goods trade can be rather relevant, especially at very long distance. So why all these matters for spatial economic analysis? So our journal is a journal that always tries to move also across fields, simply because at the origin, and we had some discussion of this before in the previous presentation, at the origin, in a sense, regional science is a galaxy of different approaches, both methodologically and also in terms of literatures. And so I think that this type of approach that is merging the international trade economics, network science, and economic geography, leading to some kind of what I may call, based on, of course, in this paper, digital network gravity, is quite relevant for spatial economic analysis and for this special issue, because it connects structural gravity, which is the workhorse of international trade policy analysis, with network theory, with economic geography, to study digital infrastructure as an important spatial determinant of economic integration. A possible research agenda, a lot of bullet points there. You see digital service trade. We want to understand, we know that this is at the center. We know that it's going to be fighting ground for policymakers at the international level when we think about digital taxations and related issues. Always this firm level exporting aspects that are the center of international economics. Global value chains, we have heard before about inshoring, offshoring. AI diffusion, this is something that I'm working on a lot now. And then regional digital infrastructure. Is this the way through which the knowledge spillovers are moving faster now? There are papers on that. Supply chain resilience, just discussed in the previous presentation. Geopolitical choke points, crucial. We've been now for quite some time been worried by what is happening in the Hormuz Strait. Internet governance, this is again, a battlefield that we'll see in the future. So what is a research agenda here could be move from digital adoption indicators to network-based measures in a more organized and structured way. So measures of where countries, regions, firms, and sectors sits in the global data infrastructure. Use physical topology of digital infrastructure as a measurable source of information frictions and multilateral market access. Embed this in these models that can be calibrated and simulated and then used for counterfactual policy analysis. So to conclude, thank you for having listened to me. The main message is simple. Digital infrastructure is a network. Network position changes the meaning of distance, and gravity models of trading goods in particular, they should incorporate digital policy and not disregard it simply because goods that are as a physical component, and therefore they're not transported through the digital cables. Where information goes through the digital cables, and this feeds back into trade frictions. So thank you for listening. Geography has mattered a lot, has always mattered a lot for goods trade. And digital geography matters too, a lot. So thank you again for giving me the opportunity to present my work.
Thank you very much, Gianmarco. Very, very interesting because it gives a very, let's say, different view on spatial aspects and also on how spatial economics, international relations, no, and networks are all related. I really hope that people will take the opportunity to develop some of these aspects in spatial economic analysis, but also elsewhere in general. The last presentation that we have is asynchronous because of time zone, of course, because I think it's 3 a.m. in the US at the moment. But the paper is very interesting because Sergio Rey analyzed income polarization on 2 dimensions. One is a distributional and one is a spatial one, and disentangling both. So I ask Alex Holmes to start with this.
Where you live shapes your economic fate, and increasingly your political fate too. This paper introduces a new way to measure something that has been hiding in plain sight, the spatial structure of income polarization. I'm Sergio Rey at San Diego State University, and this is Mind the Gap and the Map, measuring distributional and spatial income polarization. We've all heard the story of places left behind, the narrative that some regions grow rich while others fall further and further behind. This story has dominated policy debates for over a decade now. It has fueled the rise of populist movements across Europe and shaped US electoral politics. There is growing consensus that we need to address spatial inequality and polarization. But here's the problem. There is far less consensus on how to measure it. Debates continue over the right spatial scale, the right time frame, and the right index. Getting the measurements right matters because if we can't accurately gauge the phenomena, we can't assess whether our policies are actually working. Before we can measure spatial polarization, we need to understand what it actually is. And here the literature has often been imprecise. Polarization has 2 faces. The first is the gap, rich and poor regions growing further apart. That's what most people think of. But the second face is just as important, the map. Incomes within each region becoming more alike. Polarization deepens not just when the distance between groups widens, but also when the homogeneity within each group increases. The classic bipolarization index due to Wolfson captures both forces in a single formula. When the between group Gini exceeds the within group Gini and the mean income exceeds the median, polarization is high. Both dimensions are essential. This leads to a crucial and often overlooked point. Inequality and polarization are not the same thing. Here's a striking example. Suppose the richest person or region transfers a small amount of income to the second richest person or region. This decreases inequality because the variance in the upper half of the distribution has fallen. But it increases polarization because group identification within the high income class has risen, while the separation between the classes remains unchanged. This has real policy implications. A progressive redistribution program might reduce inequality on conventional measures while actually deepening the polarization it was meant to address. Existing methods fall into 2 camps. Distributional indices like Wolfson's that ignore geography entirely, and spatial indices like Zhang and Combers that require you to predefine the regions before the analysis even begins. Each approach misses something the other captures. Let me be specific about what's missing. All current spatial polarization measures require the researcher to define regions exogenously, that is, before looking at the data. And those definitions are then held fixed for the entire study period. If you're studying, for example, Mexico over 70 years, you pick regions in 1940 and those same regions apply in 2000. But economies are not static. Growth reshapes economic geographies. New regional formations emerge. Fixing the partition can mask precisely the dynamics you're trying to study. No existing method simultaneously captures both distributional structure and the spatial structure of the polarization in a unified dynamic framework. This is the gap this paper fills. The key idea is to represent spatial polarization as the overlap of two graphs. The first graph, the attribute graph, connects any two locations that are on the same side of the income distribution. If two states are both below the median income, they are linked. If two states are above, they are linked. If one state is above and one state is below, they are not linked. The second graph, the spatial graph, connects locations that are geographically adjacent, i.e. sharing a border. The intersection graph keeps only the edges that appear in both graphs, pairs of location that are income similar, and geographic neighbors. The connected components of this intersection graph are the regions, and they emerge directly from the data. No predefinition required, no fixed partition. The regions are endogenous, dynamic, and economically meaningful. From this intersection graph, we can construct the spatial bipolarization index. It measures how many connected components the intersection graph has relative to a theoretical minimum and maximum. When the polarization is maximal, two big spatial blocks, one rich, one poor, the index equals 1. When there is no spatial polarization, every location is an island disconnected from income similar neighbors. The index will equal 0. For Mexico in 1940, the intersection of the spatial contiguity graph and the bipolar attribute graph yields 6 components. Plugging into a formula gives us a spatial polarization value of 0.87, high polarization. And looking at those components tells a vivid story. All 16 low-income states form a single connected mass stretching from the southern border northward. The high-income states, in contrast, are fragmented into 5 separate components. The framework operates at 3 scales simultaneously. At the global scale, the single index tells you is polarization concentrated in space overall. At the mesoscale, you can decompose by which side of the distribution is driving things. In 1940 Mexico, the low-income cluster is perfectly spatially cohesive, a score of 1.0. The high-income side scores only 0.73, reflecting its fragmentation. Poor states cluster tightly, rich states scatter. At the local scale, every individual state gets its own score, telling you how much of the spatial polarization each location contributes to or experiences. This creates a rich diagnostic picture that no single index can provide. The paper illustrates the framework using state-level per capita GDP in Mexico from 1940 to 2000 over 32 federal units. The choropleth maps show a clear and persistent north-south divide. Southern states like Oaxaca, Chiapas, and Guerrero sit persistently at the bottom. Northern states like Baja California, Sonora, and Chihuahua climb toward the top. The spatial structure of the disadvantage is concentrated and stable. The spatial structure of advantage is diffuse and fragmented. This asymmetry turns out to be a central finding of the empirical portion of the paper. Now here's the result that I think is most important for policy. Over the period 1940 to 1980, tiles T, a standard measure of income inequality, shows a steady decline. Mexico states were converging over this period. By conventional measures, the country was becoming more equal. But the spatial Wolfson index tells a very different story. It fluctuates, rises in the 1950s and 1970s, and after 1980, it increases again and stays elevated, even as inequality by the tiles measure is stable or falling. Redistribution across Mexican states reduced the average disparity, but the geographic pattern of that disparity became more polarized over time. Income inequality and spatial polarization followed different trajectories. A policy that only watches tiles T would miss the spatial polarization that persisted and intensified. Perhaps the most methodologically important result comes from comparing static and dynamic regional definitions. Using Hansen's fixed 1996 regionalization of Mexico, 5 regions defined to study the NAFTA, and applying the tile decomposition gives what I call a tile static. That statistic peaked around 1970 and declined after 1980. Using the intersection graph to define the regions anew, each decade gives tile dynamic. It is consistently higher and peaks in 1980, revealing a restructuring of spatial polarization that the static approach simply cannot detect. Fixed regions mask the story. Dynamic, endogenous regions reveal it. Let me close with what this paper offers researchers and policymakers. It delivers a unified, flexible framework for measuring spatial polarization that integrates both the distributional and the geographic dimension, simultaneously at multiple scales without requiring predefined regions. The Mexican case study shows that income inequality and spatial polarization are not the same and can move in opposite directions and require different tools to understand. Southern states of Mexico form a spatial poverty trap, cohesive, persistent, and spatially concentrated and disadvantaged. That pattern is invisible to existing methods. If you study regional inequality, economic geography, or the political consequences of uneven development, this paper has tools that I hope you might find useful. The methods are being implemented in the open source Spatial inequality package. You can download the paper, mind the gap, and the map.
Thank you. So we are now at the end of this seminar. Thank you to all those that have been attending online, and also thank you to the speakers. And thank you to all the authors that accepted our invitation to contribute to this special issue, because I have to remember that all of these papers were invited, but then double-blind peer-reviewed, which required each of them to put there quite a lot of additional effort. So the full special issue will remain freely available online until the end of July, and I hope that many of the attendees can take the opportunity to download the papers that were presented today and also other papers that have been published. So thank you very much to all of you. Bye bye.